Hello and welcome back to Mesmeric Development. Today we are going to be talking about planning to finish your game. So if you're going to be working on a really small game for say like a game jam or something, right, where you're just going to be spending like a couple days to a week on it, you may not need to plan as much. It might still be a good idea to just figure out what the game is, put some ideas down on paper for it, but you probably don't need more than a page for something like that. But when you're working on those bigger projects, if you don't plan, it becomes extremely hard and virtually impossible to finish them, especially as a solo developer, just because there's so much you have to do. You're going to lose sight of your project, and it's just not going to go well because you won't know what to implement next because you won't have that plan, and the project usually just gets thrown away after a few weeks of working on it because there's no list to follow. If there's a list to follow, it becomes much easier to actually carry the instructions on that list out. And basically, it's easier to make a game that's already been made than it is to make something from scratch, because when you're making the game, you really can't see what you're making until it's done. If you have it down on paper, you can see what you're making, and that's kind of the idea behind actually planning out your stuff. So the first thing you want to do is you obviously need to decide what you want to make. Now, this step should not be that hard, but it often is. Now, basically, this is what's equivalent to writer's block for game devs, almost exactly. It's not necessarily that you're struggling with a particular thing, you just have no idea where to even start. So, things you want to keep in mind for this first off are you're working on your own, so your game needs to be attainable. Some genres to probably stay away from would be like a multiplayer FPS, MMO, RPG, right? You're not going to be able to make that because a team with 500 people couldn't make that. Now, the other thing, you can make some advanced stuff. You can do multiplayer stuff. You can probably do an MMO if you wanted to. You could do an open world map. You can do all that stuff. You might not want to do all the stuff together, but here the thing is, the more time you're willing to spend on a project, the more you can do. So you need to be realistic. Is this project going to take you a year? Is it going to take you 2 years? It very well may take you that long. It may take you 5 years. So depending on how long you're willing to spend on your project, you need to be able to scope for that. Scoping is something that probably deserves its whole own video, but basically the general idea is to be realistic about stuff. You can do more than like putting squares on a sprite and making them move, right? That's not going to take you 2 years, but you can't do an MMO RPG with open world map that also has multiplayer. I guess that's MMO, but you get the point. I think the next thing, money can be used as a substitute for time. Now, in general, buying art assets seems like a bad idea. The one exception to this, I would say, would be characters, because if you're not a character designer, that is going to take you a very long time, and that might be worth something. That would be one thing worth looking into buying. And you can just get some animations for free too, especially generic walk animations, since those are going to be the same and stuff no matter what you're doing. But with some of the other stuff, right, you don't want to just buy assets, because then it looks like an asset flip, which you don't want to make an asset flip. Asset flips, no one wants to buy them. They just look bad. So you don't want to go out and just buy some kit or even get a kit for free, especially not do that, and then just put it together, especially for the art. That will kill your project. So when I say money can be a suitable substitute for time in many cases, that doesn't mean that you should go out and buy art assets. I'm really more talking about the tools you'll want. You should probably look into buying tools. One I use is called Peak for Unity. Really good, very good, increasing workflow. It does that very well. Basically, it just lets you work in full screen, and you can click on objects and pull up the menus. That saves me many hours, probably overall. And there are other organizational tools for Unity, like Rainbow Folders is one I know. But you should look in, if you are going to be spending money on your project, you should certainly look into those things. And like I said, character design, maybe a weapon design. If you want to buy a weapon or something that's generic art, sometimes it can work out, but you wouldn't just want to like buy a kit for your map or something. And even if you do buy an asset, I would highly recommend changing it up a little bit just so it's harder to tell that you bought that asset, basically. Because you don't want to have the same character in 50 different games. You want to, so if someone else has it, you want yours to be different. Next, you need to work on your game. This is usually called a game doc. A lot of people think this is just an outline for your game. I would really argue that this is your game. When you're actually programming, you're implementing things, and that's the implementation of it. But this is your game. This is what you're making. This is why this step is often overlooked. People work on it usually. This is usually something people do, even in small projects. But people don't spend nearly enough time on it. This document should really cover everything. Now, you don't need to make your game. You don't need to put code in it, right? You don't need to actually make the art. But it should say what you need to make. It should basically be complete enough to where if you were to give it to another developer, if they were to decide to make this game, it would be a clone of your game. It would be very similar. That's how complete it needs to be. If you couldn't give this to someone else and have them understand it to the point where if you both made the game, it would look basically like the same game, except some different art probably, and a couple different features, that would be bad. You need to have a very detailed outline. So the first thing I like to do is outline what I need with a table of contents, right? Let's say I'm making an FPS. What do I need? Well, first off, I would need a movement system, right? And the movement system would have a bunch of stuff, but when you're outlining, you don't put everything. You just put a little bit of stuff. You just put the very basics of what you want. So you'd say movement, and then in the movement chapter, you would have the WASD, you would have your movement mechanics like vaulting, jumping, etc., right? Crouching. You would have everything there. Then you would need a combat section probably. In that you would have your shooting, you would have that stuff. You would need your art section where you would have animation and stuff. Now, you should probably stay away from text stuff because text stuff is more implementation. You do need to plan that, but this is really, there are different ways of implementing the tech stuff, so you don't necessarily need to detail your networking in this or anything like that. But you should detail the rules of your game and the features of it, basically. And you want to do everything. And when you're deciding on how to do something, you should usually research it because there's a lot of good information out there. For example, with my movement system, I wouldn't just go out and look for a movement system. I would actually look at other people's movement systems. What are the best movement systems? What are the best movement systems for my type of game? And what things should you do to make a good movement systems? What are the good features of movement systems, right? Like, for example, should I have my player accelerate and decelerate, or should it just be instant? And I think for a movement system, that obviously depends on what you're making. If you're doing a platformer, you probably want the player to have a lot of control. If you're making a competitive FPS, the same thing is probably true. The problem with that is you probably also want it to look natural, right? So that means you kind of need to balance between acceleration and deceleration and complete control of the character. Now that's just an example, but I think that's, a lot of things are complex even if they don't seem complex. So that's why I think you should really go out of your way to research everything and really try and take some time on actually deciding what you're going to write in a section. So, like I just said, you're going to write about that when you're done, and you're just going to put what you're done, what you want to do in that document. And then, once the document is done, you're just going to read and revise it. So, that means if something's not consistent, if something doesn't fit with another part, you change it. And you should probably go through, read and revise a few times. So, basically, the workflow for this is you outline with what you want, just an outline, then you research, then you write down about something, then you research about something else and write down about that, and you just keep doing that until you're done with the table of contents. Then you read and revise it. If there's something missing, you put it in. If something from this system won't work with something from here, if something is just inconsistent, right? If your art style is not going to be proper for what you're doing, you're going to change it up a little bit. If you need a different type of movement system, right, you're going to change it. If something with the combat isn't fitting with something from the movement system, you're going to change something in one of those two. And that's really what you're doing when you're reading and revising things. You're just making things fit together. You're making things be more fluent. This is really going to help with your game feel. This is where the game feel comes in. If things aren't consistent, it's not going to feel good. Now, I would say this is really the bulk of the work. The next thing you should do is for every system you put in your game document, you should create a tech document. Or not necessarily for that system, but you should probably just have one. You can make it however you want, right? But this should include how you're going to implement it, right? It's not about writing the exact code, but it is about the general premise. What needs to be done to make this? How does it work? What skills do I need to have? How will I actually do this? Those are the questions you should be asking. The next thing, you actually want to research it and make sure you're going to be doing it when you do it in the best way. So especially for like code and stuff, you want to do performance research. But the same would be true for art, right? If you need less vertices or the best way to apply a texture to something. That's really important. That's how you're going to get your game to actually run well. This is really about planning out how your game is going to work and how it is going to run efficiently and how it is actually going to be implemented. This is about actually planning the implementation. So then you just want to figure out what tools are you going to need to implement a system and what tools should you get. So if you are going to be spending money on your project, this is probably one place where you should be willing to spend it is on some tools. If you need different tools to implement something, you should buy some different tools, right? If you can or if you want to. Now, you may not want to spend money on your project, and then you should probably be looking at what tools can you get for free, right? What tools can you use? For an example, under this, if I wanted to do 3D modeling and animation, I would probably put Blender as my tool because I use Blender. You might use something else. You might use Maya, or you might use something else. But this is just where you're going to decide what you need. Finally, you actually need to plan. Everything else was planning out to plan, really, and your game document was planning your game. Your tech document was planning out how to plan. When you make a plan, you should probably use some sort of software. Everything else has just been a typed up document, but this should really be a to-do list, and it should be a very detailed to-do list. When I do it, I break things up into linear blocks. Basically, I have a system I want to implement first. And sometimes it gets mixed up, and then you just kind of implement it in stages, right? Maybe I need to do movement first, then networking and combat need to be both done at the same time or something, depending on how you're doing it, or one is dependent on the other, and sometimes you have cross dependencies and it can get a little messy, but that's okay. In general, it's good to just write, okay, I'm going to implement this system, this system, this system, then this system, and then under each of those you put the subtasks, right? Now, different people have different philosophies. I think it's good in this document to you can just copy and paste what you had in your tech document and in your game document. But if you can add some details to your plans, I use ClickUp, right? You can attach a document to something with that software. It's completely free. I would recommend it, but you should use a software where you can do that. Some people use Trello. I would not use Trello, although it does work well. I think for bigger projects, it's really nice to have a software like ClickUp or Asana or something like that. That's a little more advanced where you can actually attach a document to a project so you can have some more details on what you're going to be working on. So once you divide it into linear blocks and you have your subtasks, and your subtasks have some details about your tech document and what you had in your game document, then you should be good to go. If you do this, you will most likely finish your game as long as you don't give up. That's really the key. If you spend enough time, you will eventually finish, as long as you did not massively overscope. The other thing to keep in mind, once this plan is made, it should be pretty much final. Now, you may need a system or something. Maybe you just forgot it. Maybe you forgot to say audio system, right? You obviously need an audio system. But once your plan is done, try to avoid implementing more features or creating more features until everything's done. And once everything is done, you're actually at least in a beta state. Maybe you're in a launch state, but if you're in a beta state, then you can start adding more features and fixing the bugs and stuff. I guess you should fix bugs before. The point is, if you plan out, feature creep can affect you as long as you don't implement features. So try to keep that benefit of it too. Don't implement more features until your game is complete. You want to have a complete game before you have a completely full game, if that makes sense. Alright, thanks for watching and goodbye.